Hi, my name is Les Allen, and I'm the convener of Philosophy Matters and the owner of Rational Realm. Tonight's talk is titled Meaning in Life, Existentialism, and our speaker is Akiva Quinn. How does one create or pursue meaning in life if there is no cosmic meaning of life? Does the absurdity of suffering and banality of repetitive human activities undermine meaning? What are the moral dimensions or altruistic requisites, if any, for leading a meaningful life? Can we only achieve meaning in life by engaging in worthwhile projects that advance the common good, or by seeking to help others and transcend self? What constitutes a meaningful life for you, and what sorts of literary, secular, philosophical, spiritual, or religious ideas or ideals inform your sense of meaning? Akiva's presentation will offer perspectives on life as meaningful based on the projects and purposes we each adopt, drawing on existentialist and absurdist thinkers including Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, Martin Buber and Viktor Frankl, among others. Akiva will explore the extent to which meaning in life may be achieved through any number of personal choices about what truly matters to an individual, and the possible role of shared moral values in creating and sustaining a life filled with purpose and meaning. Tonight, Akiva will argue that meaning in life is for most, if not all, people necessarily interpersonal, communal, and more broadly social, no less in the age of COVID and during times of physical isolation. As our sense of self is relational and life purpose entails concern for both self and others. Let me introduce our speaker, Akiva Quinn. Akiva's first true love in the realm of ideas is philosophy, especially the sort of practical wisdom explored in applied ethics, moral, political and social theory, or praxis. He studied philosophy and sociology at Monash University and completed an MA there in 2010. Akiva enjoys philosophy and literature with a focus on meaning and morality, and has co-presented several workshops on life purpose and meaning in life. His other training is in the discipline of computer science, and he works in software development where logic and reason also play key roles and meaning can be crafted as well.
Thank you so much, Les. And before I screen share while we're sort of looking at each other's faces a bit more, I'd like to, besides thanking Les for the opportunity, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for attending and I'm sure participating with your ears and with your keyboard in the chat if you wish, and with the mouth, which is such an important element of human freedom, it seems, because most of the time it would appear that we can say more or less what we want to, although maybe it's what we're socially conditioned to say. So there'll be many discussions later, but I genuinely wanted to just thank each of you for taking the time to join us this evening for what I hope will be a good discussion. So, noting the time, we've got a bit of material to get through, so I will screen share so you can see some notes, which will hopefully help explain what I'm going to try and go through. So I imagine you can all see that fine. That's our topic. I might just pause a little bit on the introductory screen just to explain the coincidence or the relationship between the two terms. So meaning in life will be a general, broad, and in the view of some at least, the ultimate question in philosophy. There are many ways of approaching it. Les mentioned having done some work in it himself. I've come across essays, I've come across theses, I've come across, sort of book length treatments on the topic. Even narrowing it to existentialism, we'll say something, but clearly not everything. But just to note that I'm looking at existentialist responses to the questions of meaning in life. There are other responses clearly, and I'd be fascinated to hear some of yours if you don't, after hearing the talk, label yourself as an existentialist. The question I put in chat, by the way, is sort of provocative only in the sense that I'm interested if initially having thought to whatever extent you have about existentialism, whether you count yourself as one of us, because I'm certainly an existentialist. And I'm interested whether anything I say this evening to explicate, explain, and, support some of the views of existentialism may persuade you to join our camp. But these are interesting points because freedom would suggest, and we'll talk about that in a minute, that you should be in whatever camp your conscience dictates. So moving on. You will note that this is pretty much what I said I would talk about, and hopefully that's what will come to pass. I will talk about these themes. I've formulated what Les put up on the websites and what Les kindly read out just before in terms of a few different questions. So just to explain the terms, meaning in life is significant for us all to consider, partly because in the view of many who reject, a deity or an overall logic to the cosmos, there will be no meaning of life. So what that means really is that there's no singular meaning of life. Therefore, individuals need to discern for themselves meaning in life or not. Perhaps there's no way of coming up with an appropriate meaning in life. But we'll decide on that. We'll think that through. So then the next question, which again is read out, is to look at whether meaning is possible despite, absurdity, despite human suffering, despite the repetitive nature and perhaps futility or banality, the everyday nature of human existence, which sometimes feels like it's somewhat devoid of meaning. The rest we've pretty much been through. We're going to consider a range of different human attributes, personal, moral, social, compassionate responses to perhaps fulfilling a meaningful life. And we're going to look at basically what sort of commitments individuals may need to make to constitute a meaningful life. So what I've listed there is the last two questions, is whether basically not having any cosmic rationale or even any overall human logic for what life is about, whether we can then find a way to meaning, and whether we must necessarily choose our values and look to transcend. I like playing chess, so the meaning of my life will be to play chess constantly, repetitively, and to the exclusion of all other pursuits for existence. And then the closing question is really the discussion. Obviously, we can respond to the material presented, but also very interested to hear your views on what constitutes a meaningful life for you. And also in particular, what sort of resources I've listed there, sort of, the arts, cultural sort of texts, literature, philosophical texts, or anything from the great traditions, including the religious traditions, which might inform your sense of meaning. Okay, I'll try not to spend too long on this. There's a great deal that could be said about existentialism. This is really just a history in terms of some landmarks, really, some individuals who have put stakes in the ground and who have had their work built on by others, including modern authors. So Kierkegaard is reasonably well known as the philosophical founder, perhaps the father, the parent of modern existentialism. And there's sort of an idea of you have to live life forward, but life can be only understood backwards. So there's a sense of reflecting on the past to enlist or establish meaning, but we're always living in the moment. Life must be lived forward. Husserl was looking at phenomenology, which is basically how human beings experience things in the world. Heidegger, who I gather was his student, was interested in those notions and also applied things to existence. looking at sort of thrownness, that people are thrown into existence and then need to make sense of it. And she most will know, sort of the famous sort of God is dead, and one of the founding parents again of existentialism. Buber, we will talk about briefly, looking at authentic existence. Sartre we'll talk about in some detail as at least a preliminary definition, or the principles underlying existentialism. De Beauvoir, I was looking for more women in the earlier history, but there are perhaps not as many as one might like, but certainly she is of great significance in terms of her theorizing and thoughts on meaning and well, what in the social sciences is sort of referred to as, social construction. So basically, people are who they learn to be by means of shaping themselves in society in a particular social context, rather than them having any fixed or essential aspect. Which, just by way of introduction to Sartre, in case you haven't encountered him before, is largely what's meant by existence precedes essence. First, we're in the world, we exist, and then we determine who we are, how we respond, and what our defining characteristics are, namely what would become then our essence. Camus we'll talk about a lot. Existentialism and absurdity picks up on some of the same themes, certainly, as Sartre and de Beauvoir. And then we'll finish with Viktor Frankl, the author of Man's Search for Meaning and the founder of logotherapy. We'll explain what that is shortly. All right, so Jean-Paul, I've been spending some time with my friends lately, so thanks for the opportunity to go back and reread his work. I hadn't actually read Nausea in quite some time. So Nausea basically is a novel of his that was written in 1938, and it's him establishing his ideas really as an existentialist, or as he later accepted the definition that he was indeed an existentialist, based on at least some definition of that term. So the idea is that everything that exists does so without necessity or reason. So there's no predetermined essence, there's no predetermined necessity, there's no reason for existence, including human existence. So there's no divine pattern, there's no human rationale for existence. Existence is, we're going to have that definition in a moment. All entities or existence is therefore contingent, including you, me, and everybody else, planets, and everyone else who's ever lived. So I'll just read quickly from Nausea so you can get a sense of it. So this is the nausea, this blinding revelation. Now I know, I exist, the world exists, and I know that the world exists. That's all, but I don't care. It's strange that I should care so little about everything. It frightens me. So we're dealing with one protagonist, essentially, Antoine Roquentin, and he is wandering around his town, and he is observing himself, which is what he's doing at this point in the novel, and he's been observing nature around him and observing other people for the previous numerous episodes. He continues, I understood the nausea, I possessed it. To tell the truth, I did not formulate my discoveries to myself, but I think that now it would be easy for me to put them in words. The essential thing is contingency. I mean that one cannot define existence as necessity. To exist is simply to be there. So pretty much existence is. There's nothing fixed. There's nothing essential about existence. It's the key term there as well, probably, is contingency. And then he goes even further, and this is the meaning of its existence. And he's talking about other people here, perhaps. It is conscious of being superfluous. So we have contingency, we have non-essential, and we have the idea of being superfluous, which is probably a bit of a sobering thought in terms of establishing meaning. However, Sartre then continues and makes the link to meaning as follows. So we'd be familiar by and large. If you're not, then Descartes' rational cogito is basically I think, therefore I am. And in this case, the pre-reflective cogito from Sartre is something that is based on experience rather than the other aspects of cognition. So they're based on what we experience in the world, and that's the basis of consciousness and reflection. So being is in itself. So that's one of our definitions. It's just being is what it is. It's filled with itself. It's opaque. It can't be analyzed any further. It is equivalent to consciousness. And the little quote there, a few words from Sartre, being is what it is. So I think that's going to be fairly similar to Heidegger, Dasein, basically existence. It is what it is. Being in itself, this gets a bit technical now from Sartre, is that which is bound and limited by its factual situation, by its past, by events that are already determined, which he refers to as facticity. So that's being in itself, as opposed to being for itself, where there's agency implied. And in that case, it's contingent because I am free to choose my values and I can engage with the possibilities that my existence affords me. So again, existence precedes essence. We exist in ourselves, we exist for ourselves, and therefore we can engage with the world as it is, devoid of any particular rhyme, reason, or meaning, but we can establish those for ourselves. We've discussed existence precedes essence, as we've just been explaining, and the idea of being thrown into existence. Sartre is a student of Heidegger, so we won't be surprised to see him using those terms, quite willingly adopting them. And people are nothing other than what we make of ourselves. So besides nausea, which we introduced in the previous discussion, Sartre also wrote his magnum opus. If I had my camera on and you were seeing me in full screen, I'd show you my copy. It's quite large, and that's the Being and Nothingness from 1943. And then he wrote an essay at the point that he accepted the social label that had been ascribed to him as an existentialist. He thought he'd owned the term as it was being applied to him, and he wrote Existentialism as a Humanism, or more precisely, he delivered a lecture which then got published under that title. So given that existence is where we start, being is just another way of explaining what existence is, we cannot avoid being the authors of the meaning in our lives. And this is the genuine, authentic opportunity for everyone who chooses to take it on, and basically for all people who exist. Arguably, it's the only way forward to establish meaning. So we necessarily start with being. If thing of thought, if you haven't come before, it's simply that being is where it all begins, and being is what it is. So it's not really something that can be given fixed attributes in any way. Right, the next friend, thanks for the opportunity to speak tonight, I've been spending a lot of time with, is Albert Camus, good friend of Sartre's. Well, largely they were good friends. They became rivals at various points. Camus, just for interest, was born in Algeria. He spent a lot of time in France. He was, like Sartre, very involved in politics, and it was the time of the German occupation of France. There were a lot of, vastly significant, issues and conflicts underway. So the little bit of the quote, which isn't on the screen, which is the start of the Myth of Sisyphus. If you're looking for reading, I'd probably recommend Nausea, but I'd especially recommend the Myth of Sisyphus if you haven't read it. It starts as follows: there is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. We'll come back to that in a moment. His text then continues, judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. So we didn't lack ambition perhaps in choosing the topic for tonight, because this is the fundamental question of philosophy, arguably of life, and he puts in the context of judging, of whether one should commit suicide. So it's a serious way of posing it. It's perhaps provocative. One could live a fairly aimless existence and just keep going. Hopefully you'll find the meaning. But he suggests the serious philosophical problem is in fact suicide. The next idea, which needs a little bit of explaining, is the idea that the absurd is born from a confrontation between a human need, which I've glossed as nostalgia for reason and longing for happiness, and the unreasonable silence of the world. So Camus writes about what he calls an odd trinity. So his odd trinity is not religious, because he is an atheist. It is the three characters in the drama. And the three characters in the drama of life are as follows. You have to sort of read between the lines of that second sentence. So the human need, the appeal to nostalgia and to impose reason on the world, is the one character in the drama. The unreasonable silence of the world, the silence doesn't offer meaning directly. You're not going to find the meaning in a rock or a whatever else that exists in the world, another human being even. And the third character is the absurd. So Camus suggests that the absurd arises as the interaction between a human need or a rational mind that is searching for reasons, understanding, meaning, happiness, all of those sorts of things which we all value, and the unreasonable silence of the world. So fairly quickly, skipping through Camus' thought then, he responds to that notion of the absurd, which he has defined in that way, to say that once doctrine is rejected through consciousness, so by doctrine he means the grand cosmic picture of explanation for meaning in the world, or for the purpose or the meaning of life, and revolts, which I'll explain some more. But basically it means you decide what your position is going to be. The absurd man, which is in fact every man and every woman, assumes the weight of their own life. So Camus concludes, I must carry it alone. So this is the unbearable lightness of being. If anybody has read Milan Kundera, for example, many authors, there's a lot of literature which basically deals with there's a weight in life, responsibility, and each of us must carry it on our own. And he also, well, I actually just wanted to tie in, because on my reading, Camus and Sartre are closer than they are opponents to each other. So people often characterize Camus as the absurdist. However, Sartre most certainly writes about the same notion. The absurd man will not commit suicide, sort of responding to Camus' question, although not directly. He wasn't writing, I don't think, in response to anything that Camus had written at this moment. He wants to live without relinquishing any of his certainty, without a future, without hope, without illusions, and without resignation. So resignation here means without, kind of giving up and having any sense that the whole enterprise is futile. Okay, I'll probably encourage you on the left-hand side of this slide to read the myth of Sisyphus if you haven't yet had the opportunity. The Greek origin story of the myth comes from Homer, and Zeus, the god, the king of the gods, I guess, the head of the gods, whatever he's called, condemns, the father of the gods, I suppose, condemns Sisyphus to eternal punishment. And the reason for that punishment is that Sisyphus actually not once but twice cheats death. We won't go into the details on that right now. And his punishment is to forever roll the boulder up a hill. Unsurprisingly, as you can see from the illustration, when the boulder eventually reaches the top of the hill, looks over, the boulder arrives back at the bottom of the hill, and Sisyphus, in Hades, no less, in the underworld, is condemned to go back down the hill, collect his rock, and carry his burden back up the hill. So Camus' interest in this is that he actually wants to focus on that hour, which is how he interprets the myth of Camus walking back down this quite significant hill to retrieve his rock. He says, man going back down the hill, like Sisyphus, has a breathing space, and that is the hour of consciousness. So when the labors are done, the task is achieved, albeit in this case it's an entirely futile task, we can consider our lives. And we conclude, Camus suggests, that all is well, we accept our burden again, and like Sisyphus, we find the universe is neither sterile nor futile. The struggle itself towards the height is enough to fill a man's heart. And then in the famous last line, which follows immediately after that, we must imagine Sisyphus happy. And that's quite a difficult concept. I don't know if I understand it. I find it slightly easier to understand the struggle as filling a man's heart or a person's heart. But that's Camus' challenge to us, even in the most abject labor. Apparently, we should imagine the laborer as happy. I won't say much about the plague other than to recommend it for those in particular who might be experiencing lockdown. I think it's a terrific literary response to the issues around isolation and so on. Just to mention a few words, Dr. Hu is the one of the key protagonists in that story, and Oran is a town on the coast of Algeria. I think it's actually a real place, but the events are of Camus, from Camus' fertile imagination. He's asked basically whether he's looking after the sick in the town. He's a doctor. He says there's no question of heroism in all of this. It's a matter of common decency. That's an idea which may make some people smile, but the only means of fighting a plague is common decency. And then there's basically ideas of, lockdown or quarantine being, a form of exile, being like prisoners. And he also focuses on a character, Rambert, who's a journalist from elsewhere, and there's an ache of separation. So one of the interesting things, without giving the entire plot away, is that Rambert does consider leaving. So whereas Dr. Hu is in the town and is applying common decency in his view to look at helping people, Hu does not choose to judge Rambert if he chooses to leave. So this is something of the response to the absurd or the existential, question, and that you get to answer it in the way you want to. So Dr. Hu would seem to have Camus' approval, and therefore what he does is good, and what he observes about others, at least in the author's view, is also good. Excellent. So you may well have some little notes happening and some questions and comments on all of this. So we're moving fairly quickly as time requires of us. So that was the potted summary of Sartre's key ideas on being and how they relate in some ways to Camus' ideas around the absurd, which also focuses on, again, existence and the nature of existence and the human struggle, where even the struggle can fill our hearts and therefore can establish meaning in our lives in the absence of any cosmic meaning. I'm very pleased to be able to at least introduce Simone de Beauvoir to anybody who hasn't read her. I did have the opportunity some years ago to read The Second Sex. It is from the 1940s, but it is one of the foundation works of possibly that was second wave feminism. I'd have to go back to my notes. There's been at least one more wave since then, and then there's sort of the current theoretical and political struggles around gender equality. So de Beauvoir, if you don't know, it's relevant that she was an intellectual companion of Sartre, a very close, collaborator in some ways, but they clearly worked independently and wrote their own material. There's possibly more words from de Beauvoir, I'm not sure, but there's certainly The Second Sex is a very long book, and she's written on ethics and all sorts of things. They were partners as well for a prurient interest, so they had an intimate relationship as well as an intellectual relationship, and we can talk about that, but it's not strictly of direct philosophical interest, perhaps. So in The Second Sex, de Beauvoir talks about being for herself. So you'll recall from the summary of Sartre, we were mostly interested in being in itself and being for itself. So there was no gender that came into it. But now, rather than being for yourself, she's going to be being for herself. So the idea is that there would be something that's constitutive of being a woman or being a man that is relevant, and that the freedom of each of the subjects needs to be reflected on by both men and women.
Can you hear me?
Edward, we can hear you. So what she then goes on to say, well, basically I want to look at sort of her approach to meaning, but also to relationships. So she's got an ethics, which is around ambiguity. And the ambiguity is essentially that we are both our factual past and our being in itself, and we are also the prospect of who we want to be, our ambition, the sense of possibility. So that's what she refers to as ambiguity, both the facticity as Sartre refers to it as, and the potential for transcendence. So we're looking at relationships. This is fairly dense, but she's looking at if we embrace that ambiguity with a modesty correlative to an authentic pride, then we'd be able to meet each other as fellows, so as equals and as subjects. So we want to basically not entirely overwhelm the other with our subjectivity, and we don't want to simply assume an object status with response to the others. So genuine mutual recognition is possible. And the final point there is really that there's another concept. So we've had being in itself, being for itself, and now we have being for others. And that is basically a relational sense of being. And we need to understand the freedom of the other. So the other with a capital O is one of her key introductions into modern thought, really, which is that we need to respect the other. We don't want to see them as objects, and we also don't want to be objectified by them. If we were fixed by their gaze, we'd be objectified by them. We'd lose the freedom, which is essential to establishing our own sense of self, and that what Sartre and following him, de Beauvoir, were referred to as bad faith. Okay. We've been talking for a while. I've been talking for a while. I'm going to fairly quickly relate what we've just discussed in terms of relationships to some notions from the first of our religious existentialists, Martin Buber. Kierkegaard, people will be aware, was most definitely a a practicing Christian, and he was looking for existentialist thought to essentially, explain for him how he was going to, what he calls, take the leap of faith. So Buber is, in a way, a descendant intellectually in terms of some of Kierkegaard's thoughts. He also borrows from Nietzsche, from what I've read, and he is also basically very much involved, and he's written several books, Martin Buber, about the Hasidim. So basically, that's sort of a Jewish mystical approach. So Buber is interested in relationships. I'm going to focus on that to a fair extent, where it's going beyond mere existence, and he's looking at authentic existence. So he's looking at authentic relationships. He's looking at our relationships with others, but he's also looking at relationships with God, a personal relationship with God. I won't delve into that because that would be a rather different topic, I think, in terms of religious interpretations and sort of theological concepts, really. However, it's worth knowing this little bit about Buber. He looks at I, it as basically one of the primary words. He speaks in quite poetic terms about what you can say. He says one of the primary words you can say is I, it, and that is a relationship between I and objects, which is what it says in the final bullet. And he says that it makes sense to consider that it comes after I. You can only identify something or somebody in the world if you exist. So that's, again, he's an existentialist. He doesn't shy away from the label. I'm not sure if the term was sufficiently around for him to adopt it, but it fits very well, because existence, again, following Sartre, is preceding essence. I comes first, and then you can identify the it. And likewise with the I thou, he's not saying actually that one is primary. He's saying that the relationship that we define ourselves with respect to others. So therefore the I thou, which is another primary word, emerges from the relationship between myself and you, let's say, where I'm the I, and in old-fashioned English, you are the thou. I gather there's newer interpretations. It's not the ones I have, newer translations, where they use thou, which is rather formal Old English, a whole lot less, and they use you. So if you just think of you in a respectful way, I, you, and we have a mutual relationship in that way, similar to what de Beauvoir was alluding to, we were talking about just before. So it, again, just to summarize, is mere existence, the past subject-object relationship, while authentic existence and authentic relationships between two subjects are formed through I, you, or I, thou. Okay, we're fairly close to wrapping up presentation, so hopefully formulating your questions and responses to meaning in life. You've had a whole 35, 40 minutes and your entire life, so I'm sure you've got plenty of material just waiting to be launched. So Viktor Frankl, the author of Man's Search for Meaning, just a few of his summaries. He writes the first half of the book just to set the context, if you're not aware. The first half of the book, he's a Holocaust survivor from the Second World War. He was interned and forced to labor and, physically whatever, beaten and all sorts of things, left on the brink of death many times in Auschwitz, I think primarily. Maybe not describe those collective experiences in a concentration camp, in a death camp for many, that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And I think just to mention, he does cite Nietzsche, that a man who has a why can live with almost any how. So if you've got a why to exist, you can live with almost any set of circumstances, which is what he said in his own words just before. Ultimately, man should not ask what the meaning of his life is, but rather he must recognize that it is he who is asked. In a word, each man is questioned by life, and he can only answer to life by answering for his own life. To life, he can only respond by being responsible. So logotherapy sees in responsibleness the very essence of human existence. So we're talking responsibility, we're talking freedom. Going back to Sartre, another one of his pithy summaries of existentialism is that man is condemned to be free. So we get to make the choices, we have to make the choice, and the meaning of life, according to the man who wrote the book with the title of People's Search for Meaning, or Man's Search for Meaning, suggests that we answer by responding in terms of our own life. It's you who's being asked, no one else, not me, not anybody else you know who you may or may not think has the answers. The answers are relevant to you. I wanted to, if we've still got a few minutes, I know we're coming up to the hour and we want to leave time for the discussion. I do have a video I wanted to play you. Then I do have one more slide. This lady is a survivor. She was in Auschwitz. She was at another concentration camp, death camp before that. And I just wondered if you can hear clearly enough to hear a few of her words.
And we had to climb out one by one. And I was blinded by daylight when I was outside. I haven't seen the day for weeks or months. And then we were ordered to stand with our hands up, facing the courtyard wall. And we were waiting to be shot. And I begged Hashem that I should be shot first before my father, who was standing next to me. On the other side of my father was my niece. But they were only searching us for any goods or anything of value, any valuables which they asked us to put out. And then we were chased out into the street. There were still some of the buildings in the ghetto burning. They were smoldering. Our Warsaw ghetto was in ruins. And we were chased. Schnell, schnell. We were chased to Umschlagplatz. If you want to know what Umschlagplatz is, it was a railway siding where the cattle trucks were packed with human cargo and returned empty, ready for another load. That was going on continually. We had to sit in an adjoining building overnight in a big hall because the train wasn't there yet. And when it got dark, the Latvian and Ukrainian guards were coming in and pulling out young girls.
So that's Ella and some small part of her story. I'll just continue. You would have heard, hopefully, clearly enough what she said. That was an interview that was conducted with her. She eventually, when the Russians liberated Auschwitz, was freed. I think perhaps a few years later ended up in Israel. Apparently met a South African man, Mr. Blumenthal, no doubt. And she lives in Cape Town. She is 99 years old. I've actually watched a lot of Holocaust testimony, and to me that was absolutely chilling, because this is a lady at that stage of life, and you could probably see from her physical presence and the way she presented her story, you know, it still chills her. She talks about sleeping with the curtains open because she doesn't want to miss a moment of, you know, light. So when the first light comes in the day, she's so appreciative of it that she wants to see the start of the day. So, you know, I don't think she just lives inside that story, fortunately for her, but that story and the relevance to meaning in life is really to highlight the moral dimension, in case we had any sense that it might not make any difference if we find happiness through the misery of others, or by, you know, violence or indifference towards others, or indeed even by what Sartre might refer to as quietism, just being inactive in the world. He says emphatically in Existentialism is a humanism. He says that existentialism is not about quietism. I'm pretty sure we'll be able to share these slides with you. Eddie Jaku is a Holocaust survivor. He is based in Sydney. I heard him speak recently through the Sydney Jewish Museum. He's 100 years old, so he's doing even better than Ella Blumenthal. And he actually takes his experience, and I read his book. It takes him a period of time, which one can understand, but he's decided that, you know, happiness is a choice, and he commits himself to all sorts of worthwhile projects, which is what we were alluding to at the beginning. And that's essentially my answer to the question which was posed, which is, by committing ourselves to projects, to work, to relationships, to all of these things, which we all know have inestimable, you know, unlimited human value, we can create an authentic and meaningful life, and also a happy life. So in conclusion, I drew a picture. Must be the computer scientist in me. Meaning, I would suggest, is supported by morality. Morality also is part of one's, you know, life purpose. The values basically that one holds dear, that one honors, that one maximizes potentially. We can have a discussion at some future time about morality as to whether it's mainly about, you know, respect for others, or whether it's about maximizing, as a consequentialist might say. And all of those things, the authenticity we've thought about, the revolt from Camus, the love which underlies so much of the relationships, you know, important mutual valued relationships, the flourishing. Flourishing is perhaps a fancy philosophical way of saying, you know, be happy. And there's a good little title there if you're interested, by the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu. My friends and family obviously thought I'd like the book so much that independently, one sister-in-law bought me a copy. And of course, independently, because I understand the existentialist, you know, requirement to, you know, seize the moment, as it were, and to make of things, of my situation, and you know, to live my freedom authentically, I of course bought a copy for myself as well. So at one point at least, I had in my possession 3 copies of the Book of Joy. So I hope you enjoy it too, if you choose to read it. In closing, again, we can share references with you. I'd be interested in your thoughts on what you found useful over time. This is really some of the texts that we have covered, and others, including the last 3, which are, you know, almost entirely contemporary. Susan Wolf talks about love and reasons of love as the foundation of meaning in life. That's her book there, Meaning in Life and Why It Matters. If you're looking for a serviceable introduction to existentialist, if you are one and want to understand it better, or if you think you might want to be one and tell your friends about existentialism, then David Sabone's Existentialism for about $20 is a good place to start. And there's plenty of other reading. And in closing, there's plenty of literature, and there's any number of films, including famously Groundhog Day, Truman Show, Spike Jonze's Being John Malkovich, an adaptation I saw recently on TV Mary Shelley, which is about, Frankenstein and the monster. And there's a huge amount of literature, and it all tries to address, rather than necessarily answer, tries to explore the primary question of philosophy and of life as to whether life is worth living or not. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Akiva.